Welcome to the Core Concepts Lecture Series. This is a show where we bring religious and spiritual leaders and have them tell us what they believe, why they believe it, and what they're doing about it. In other words, how did they come to that belief, and how is it manifesting in their lives? This show is sponsored by the Open Heart Spiritual Center, the Institute of Applied Metaphysics, and the Church of Revelation. Our guest today is John Madsen, and John has been with us once before. He's not what you could call representing an organized religion. John is a self-confessed lone wolf, but he will be talking to you today about creativity and how he works with people in this process. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, James. It's nice to be back. Good to see everybody again. If I'm going to put a formalized title to what I'm going to try and present, it would be creativity and spirituality, because it's my assertion that, and it's been my experience, that creativity and spirituality seem in human behavioral terms over anthropological time to be very closely linked. And from my own perspective, my forays into creativity and the activities I do that people choose to describe with that word, creativity, have had a lot to do with my own spiritual development and growth over the past years. And I'll start kind of by remembering a touchstone quote that I read many years ago. There's a community over in central Tennessee that's they're still there. They were founded as a commune in the late 60s called The Farm, and their leader at that time was a guy named Stephen Gaskin. And one of the things I read that he said in an interview was that your science, your art, and your religion should all be pretty much the same thing. They should all be parts of the same comprehensive whole. And I guess I was 15 or so when I read that. So for about 45 years now, that thought's been rattling around in my head. And I finally get to a place where I can put some of those pieces together. And that's the essence of what I want to share with you today. So we'll begin by defining what thinking a little bit about what creativity is and is not. I did a workshop on creative activity several years ago, and people kept coming to me saying things like, I'd like to participate, but I can't draw a straight line. And my response to them, of course, was, well, what does drawing a straight line have to do with creativity? So people think of creativity and immediately they start thinking in terms of certain packaged activities. Do you paint? Do you write poetry? Do you act in plays, etc.? And while those are fine as outlets for creativity, they're not the creative act itself. The creative act is, I have a note here that says, it's an activity that records an act of imagination. It's a recording of a first occurrence, something that hasn't happened before. It's not the use of a skill, and it's not subject to comparison or competition. People have a thing about, I'm more creative, I'm less creative, I'm more creative than some, less creative than others. And really, it's a qualitative thing. It's either present or it's not. It's an energy that's either flowing or it's not. So we tend to, again, we live in a society where things tend to be made, forced to become hierarchical. And it's an energy that just doesn't, it has nothing to do with hierarchies. So I put together a timeline here of some of the creative events in human history, and I'm looking back into old history, into anthropological time rather than post-historical time, because I was looking for things that would be illustrative of the human brain, interacting with the environment and looking for something that improves life or my activity or something in some way, and seeing if there's kind of a sequence that suggests itself in this series of developments. So we find that about 1 million years ago, humans started to make cutting tools, primitive stuff out of obsidian, just chip it till you got a blade, so you can do whatever you need to do with that cutting tool, which evolved over a period of merely 800,000 years to the tipped spears. Artisanate activities started showing up 85 to 100,000 years ago when we began to make objects to adorn ourselves with. They found in South Africa, there's a site where they found seeds and nuts and things that had been strung on fiber. and they were worn, so that was the beginning of that art form. Calendars, suggesting that humans were aware of the passage of time as a finite thing, began, not a calendar as we know it, things that moved, that measured time in terms of astronomical movement, started showing up about 30 years ago. And then we had the first religious, if you will, artifacts showing up about 24,000 years ago. A lot of people are familiar with the artifact known as the Venus of Willendorf. There were a number of similar archetypal images that were created in different places at around roughly that time between 24 and 18,000 years ago. And then the bow and arrow, not too long after that. Again, look at the evolution from cutting tool to tip spear to bow and arrow. And finally, from ornamentation as jewelry to marking the passage of time to the beginning of religious artifacts. And we find a dig at a site called Göbekli Tepe in Western Europe, or Western Turkey, that dates back about 12,000 years. And the importance of that particular site is as follows. It has been the conventional wisdom amongst anthropologists and archaeologists that the sequence of human developments was that we were hunter-gatherers for a period of time, and then we acquired the skill set of agriculture. And agriculture, in turn, made possible living in constructed communities, the specialization of labor, and then the beginnings of culture as we know it, art, religion, etc., and so forth. What Göbekli Tepe shows us is that at about 12,000 years ago, a community of humans had come together to build a structure very similar to Stonehenge. It measured it was structured so as to measure astronomical time, and it was decorated with a lot of carvings that are really pretty ornate, suggesting the primitive animistic religions of the time. So we have humans gathering here together to build this site, and they reckon that they're, from the size of the site, the number and distribution of types of tools they found, their estimation is that they had to keep approximately 300 people working on this site over time to get it constructed, which then posed the problem, if we're hunter-gatherers, how do we feed 300 people that aren't moving? And lo and behold, not too far away from this site, at approximately the same time, they find the beginnings of agriculture. So that suggests then that the dynamic behind human development wasn't food, buildings, and temples. It was worship, communal worship, followed by agriculture, followed by food, buildings, etc. Which implies very strongly that in the essential human nature, in whatever it is that makes us distinct in how our mind and our emotions and our imaginations come together, there always has been a union between technology, philosophy, art, and what you would call hard skill activities. The dichotomy between religion and science is something that appeared fairly late in human history. They appear to have been closely united as of the date of this site. So that's a history of a little bit of a history of some evolutions of creativity, but we're still sitting here at this, with the core question of what is it? And most people assume, I think erroneously, that creativity is about making something out of nothing. And I would, I'm going to cite one of my favorite authors in a little bit here, but I would reject that notion. And I suggest to you that we're sitting at a time in human history where at least technological creativity has been exploding at a rate that's been heretofore unseen. And if we think back through that technological evolution, say, since the end of World War II, when Thomas Edison Jr. sold his basic computer instruction set to General Electrics, as we see the evolution of binary and digital technology, it has been very strongly incremental. There's been an increment in, we moved from transistor tubes to transistors to silicone wafers, and so that this creativity that's undoubtedly has taken place has been in a series of increments rather than a huge event where something appears from nothing. And I think that ties fairly well in with what we know about physical creation as an act of intention by a deity. It didn't start from nothing, as, say, a biblical account might suggest, but it began with the Big Bang Theory, something we haven't denoted yet, but at some point, at some instance, there was matter before all of this began to occur. So I had referenced somebody I was going to cite to you, a guy named Arthur Koestler, who in the 50s and 60s was a pretty influential philosopher and thinker, and he was one of the first people to begin approaching a lot of the philosophical and theological dilemmas that modernity was posing, or the postmodern era. And he wrote a book called The Act of Creation. And again, that's something I read when I was 15, and I've kind of been trying to wrap my mind around the contents since then. But without being able, again, to define or in some way issue a metric that shows you how creative something is, he posited that there were three human activities wherein creativity took place. One of them was, of course, artistic creation. The second was the practice of humor. And the third was the scientific deduction, where a technically oriented person is observing a series of phenomena or events and determines a dynamic that's driving them that wasn't understood before. As an analogy, of course, we can think of Newton. At the moment, supposedly, the apple fell on his head, and he said, "Whoa, that means there's gravity. I know what gravity is. It's what makes the apple fall down." Well, the interesting thing about that, as a scientific deduction, wasn't so much that he recognized that the apple had fallen in the direction of down, but from the astronomical understanding of how the world and planets functioned at the time. Newton's point wasn't that this is down, because he knew that on the other side of the world, that down was somebody else's up. He understood. He made the deduction that there is something associated, that mass had a property that it exerted on other physical objects, and that property that it exerted is what we know as gravity. So in that moment, he had like an intuitive leap that advanced understanding of the world around us by a small increment. And Koestler uses a joke. He tells a joke in his book that I'll share with you. Two Jewish mothers meet each other in the grocery store. And one says, "Oh, and how is that fine son of yours, Nathan? How is Nathan doing?" And Nathan's mom says, "Well, Nathan's very well, but I'm afraid he's developing a little bit of an Oedipus complex." And the other woman says, "Oedipus schmedipus, as long as he's a good boy and loves his mother." Okay. He actually tells another one. I'll share that. Two women meet each other in the grocery store, and one says, "Oh, I love what you've done with your hair." And the other woman says, "Well, actually, it's a wig." And the first woman says, "Well, nobody will ever notice." So, and what we find there, and this is how Koestler explains the phenomenon of creativity. It's important for all of us to understand things within the context that they take place. Context can be a number of things. It could be a person's individual cultural background. It could be the cultural time that surrounds it. It could be seasonal. But all things take place within this envelope that we call context. And what happened, as illustrated by that one joke, was that two contexts were juxtaposed. The idea of Oedipal complex and the idea of good boy and loves his mother. And from the juxtaposition of these two seemingly unrelated contexts, there emerges a synergy, or a third entity, which is, in this case, humor. We can think of art and say the beginnings of the Impressionist period, when people had been working to do very realistic, directly representational landscapes and portraits and so forth. And all of a sudden along came, at some moment, this group of artists who said, "But I want to capture the sensory experience of seeing that object rather than just rendering the object. And of course, they began to paint what was their impression of things. And again, if you look at that, the growth of modern art since then, it's been incremental. That was the first increment of change. And it was only a few increments later that we have abstracts, with the increments in between being cubism, pointillism, and some others. So there's the gist of what Kessler had to share with us, was that creativity is when we take two contexts that don't seem to be interrelated, juxtapose them, and from that deduce or infer or observe a new relationship. So, people have asked me, I do a number of things that are considered artistic. I make 2 or 3 styles of jewelry, and I do some painting, and I've done some writing, and I have played music, percussion, and guitar. And so people have asked me, where do you get your creative energy from? And I hadn't really considered it until just lately, but the stock answer that I've given over a period of years is, to me, creativity is a couple of IQ points that don't have anything to do and go out and play in the backyard with mental illness. So, but again, even in that funny little explanation, what am I doing there? And this is what I hadn't realized myself until I thought about it. I put two contexts, IQ and mental dysfunction, together and said, wait a minute, there's a synergy there, and this poof, we have this offshoot of what we can describe as creativity. How do we achieve creativity? Boy, that's another issue. But I've given a workshop on trying to rediscover creativity, and I'll submit an event for your consideration. Some years ago, about 4 years ago, I had a grandson who was 3 years old, turned 3 years old shortly before Christmas. And our little grandson, was in the process of collecting his cowboy outfit. So as we approached Christmas, he had a little cowboy hat, and he had a little cowboy vest with a badge on it, and he had a little pair of cowboy chaps. And so for Christmas, we gave him a pair of cowboy boots. And this little fellow tucked his cowboy boots on, and then he stood up and he strode across the living room like this, even with his little legs bowed and his feet rolled outwards. And here's what happened. As a child, he exercised transformative imagination, because in his experience at that moment, he was a cowboy. So we all, I think, as children, have that capacity to imagine and then become, that at some point as we learn social roles that become progressively more restrictive, we overwrite that in the cortex with all kinds of instructions and rules and conventions, and what we lose is that moment when we go, oh, what if, and believe in what we do as the what if. So, how then does that relate to a spiritual practice? And it's been my experience in my observation that there are certain things we have to do in order to make that what if manifest itself. We very definitely have to get out of self. We have to leave the ego behind and get to a place where we understand that what is about to happen, or that moment of liftoff that we're looking for, is something that we ourselves can't really manufacture. It hasn't happened yet. We don't know what it is. Remember, creativity is the first occurrence. The first time you have the thought, the first time you see the insight, the first time a photographer sees a juxtaposition of objects and tries to copy them. We're looking for that first instant. The reason why I think creativity is useful as a spiritual practice is that, and again, here's a juxtaposition of art and science and religion. The people who are at the cutting edge of physics tell us that we live in what they're increasingly finding to be a multidimensional universe. And that's kind of the core of the human dilemma. Somehow we sense the presence of this otherness, but our senses, our brain, and the brain being the theater in which we experience our lives, they only work in 3 dimensions. So human history, our urge to grow and decorate and stuff, can be seen as an attempt to reach some form of otherness, the presence of which we sense, but we don't have an overt physical tangible mechanism to get to it. Unless, of course, we can find that moment of transformative imagination and activate that in an attempt to perceive multidimensional reality, the presence of God, depending on your vocabulary, and so forth. So then we have creativity can aid us in perceiving a multidimensional universe. It can aid us in setting aside the ego. And it can also help us in transitioning the self-other barrier, the self/other barrier. And what I mean by that is this: when behavioral scientists know that at an astonishingly early age, our first conception, the first cognitive understanding we form, is that I'm an infant, I don't know what anything is, I'm absorbing this huge torrent of undifferentiated sensory data, and then there's a moment where we begin to perceive, wait, some of this is self, and the rest of it is other. And we form that division. And then as we go on in life, that self-other barrier keeps getting taller, and it replicates itself in more and more human functions, to the point where we have the phenomenon that people do these days called cocooning, where all we do is sit on my side of the self-other barrier, and it's just me here. Of course, we have John Donne writing that no man is an island, etc. and so forth, and I think we're all islands. But the self-other barrier exists in the status quo. It is what it is. Things are my perceptions, my understandings. To try and activate transformative imagination, we've got to let go of that self and other barrier, because we're in pursuit of something that we haven't yet perceived. We're going to try and find something that we can't define, so where can it be? And that self-other barrier just has to be set aside in order to let that moment happen. And lastly, when I was growing up, I went to Catholic grade schools growing up, and the nuns taught us that at the top, we were supposed to, top of our papers, whatever we were working on, we should write the letters AMDG, which stood for a group of Latin words that were translated as all to the greater honor and glory of God. So, what is the nature of our universal spiritual quest as exemplified by that phrase? It's to understand God, the divinity, whatever your divinity is, as best we can, as we perceive it in the divinity's word. When you've created something, I have found, when you've created an object, I find that the best work I do is less because a plan of mine works out. Frequently I've gotten wonderful results because a plan of mine went just plain up in smoke. And it's often seemed to me that lovely, wondrous, created objects have their own will to come into existence. And whatever that particular energy is that allows you to facilitate the transition of this object from not being there to being there, when we do that and regard that object and examine our relationship to this thing that we helped birth, maybe we begin to understand what the experience of the divinity was like in intentioning the physical universe as we know it to come into existence. And I submit to you that if we were to examine our own relationships with the things we create, transpose that understanding to the divine entity, and regard the world around us as that entity's creation, and imagine how that entity perceives what has been created, I would suggest that many of us would behave differently towards ourselves, towards others, and towards our surroundings if we just imagine, what if I had created this? if I had created this, how would I want this creation to be regarded by others, by humans? So that is what I have to say today. I hope it's helpful to somebody somewhere at some time. And with that, peace and love, y'all. I'm done.
Do we have some questions? How do you use your art in your counseling? You do a lot of work with people and helping them to find that creativity, find spirituality, whatever it is that they're looking for. How do you use the art in that?
Well, that's a question that has a deeply personal answer.
That don't mind being personal.
That I'll go ahead and share with you. Some years ago, now the word shamanic has been overused as a cliche, but some years ago, a very knowledgeable spiritual practitioner, on the occasion of the first time I had met this person, she said, "You have shamanic energy, but there are 5 different things that shamanic energy achieves, that shamans have done. And you're not a healer, and you're no longer a warrior, although you may have been one." She said, "You need to study the practice types of shamans and find the one that's appropriate for you." She said, "I don't know what it is, but I know it's there." So I did some reading, and shamans do lots of different things. They heal, they keep lore, they instruct, and there's one function that's not often documented, but it's to assist people in finding their own spiritual vision. And I call that giving people aha moments. And a lot of times in the counseling, you can find a way to phrase something so somebody goes, aha, or you can take an object and describe what you see in it in conjunction with what they see in it, and somebody has an aha moment. And those are the moments when we learn. Grow and become bigger. I hope that's a sufficiently circuitous answer to your question.
That's good. But now I know I have observed you with a individual in which you are doing working with either their aura or something that you see in them, and you're putting it down. Tell us what's going on there.
Well, you're talking about aura portraits. Some years ago, I used to attend a weekly Reiki circle out in Bartlett, and I got to the point where rather than receive Reiki from an individual practitioner, I would literally sit on the floor in a corner and get off into the void. And as soon as I began to experience that energy and got to the void or the deep relaxation place, I'd start seeing clouds of colors floating around. And somebody suggested I try and do some art with that, so for the first time in 40 years, I got watercolors out, started slashing. And one night, one of the practitioners said, "Okay, I'm going to sit in front of you and meditate, and I just want you to capture whatever you see." So I did, little generic face, color things, and then she showed me how each of the colors related to a specific chakra, and that there was something going on in her life that was why that chakra was flowing particularly. And she said, "So John, what you've constructed here is a portrait of my aura." And I've been doing those for about 4 years now, and I'm finding that has built frequently, and it's a funny experience. It's tough to define. It's much more intuitive than anything else, which means I don't know how it works. But yeah, if I can focus on somebody, if they're in a meditative state of mind, I see the clouds of colors drift by, I catch it in a piece of art, then I have a guide to about 35 different tints and hues of color. And I sit down and go over it with the person. It's not unusual that clairvoyancies happen and emerge in some detail that gets represented in the painting. So voila, that's that.
And then you're also creating medallions, and I've seen some of those. They're very interesting, very pretty.
Yeah, thank you.
What do they have to do with? What's it relate to?
Well, oh boy. I acquired a fascination with jewelry years and years and years ago. And I saw some jewelry that had been made in the material format called enamel, which is glass, colored glass that's been fused to a metal. And I got interested in that, and I ran across an opportunity kind of synchronicitously to market it through a young person who was repping merchandise into the metaphysical store business. And she carried it. So that turned into, well, can you do an Eye of Horus? Of course I can do an Eye of Horus. How do you spell that, please? And I look it up on the computer and find the image and create the piece and stuff. That kind of propelled me into studying symbols and ancient symbols and ritualistic or spiritual or religious
Archetypes.
symbols, yeah, which I kind of conceived of in my own mind as archetypes, and so that's a body of work that I put together. I think right now I've probably got 80 or 90 different symbols, and it's been fascinating just to learn about them and how they evolved, and there's primal power to a lot of those symbols.
Now, if you're in the Memphis area, you can see some of John's work at the Circle on Whitten Road and probably other venues as well. But could you give our viewers some contact numbers, how they could get in touch with you? And
Absolutely. My phone number for the cell phone that I've got vibrating in my pocket at the moment is area code 901-230-6198. My email address is johnmadsen53@yahoo.com, or as they say in Mississippi, yahoo.com. I'm getting a signal. M-A-D-S-E-N is how my last name's spelled, because it frequently comes out M-A-D-S-O-N, you're right. So that was good. And I do a lot of contact with people on Facebook, where I'm just John Madsen on Facebook, and I do some of the aura portraits remotely. If I can hear somebody's voice, I can work from a photograph. I just did one in Virginia Beach for a lovely young 17-year-old girl who has a horse. I did her and the horse, and beautiful colors came out. That was a fun experience.
so you are doing private counseling?
On a very unstructured basis.
Where you might do the aura painting.
Yes.
Are you conducting classes anywhere? Now, I know you're doing some workshops. You mentioned doing workshops. But,
Well, I want to start doing some workshops in various jewelry making techniques. I'd like to continue doing this type of thing, and I have put on an exercise workshop in creativity that takes several hours, where I help the group through a series of creative activities that are designed to exclude doing anything that using any pre-existing skills. And then we use the objects that are created by the group to define a particular space. We do some guided meditations, etc. And people have reported to me in very fairly tangible ways that it has an effect, and it changes how they think and see things.
Well, not being associated with any organized religion, you're probably not conducting rituals anywhere.
Nope.
But you are doing meditation workshops, or where people...
I have done some of those, and I provide a service which I call, for lack of a better phrase, a guided meditation. Lots of people are running around maxed out on stress levels. And so I decided to develop a technique where you would use multiple pathways to the brain to generate the relaxation response. So I combine aromatherapy and a little bit of sound therapy and a little bit of median therapy on the hand. I work the medians on the hands and feet, and then against a background of sound, a guided meditation using a couple of visualizations of a couple of images that I think are very powerful, and people get deeply relaxed. I've had people tell me they slept through the night for the first time in months and months, things like that.
So you are doing on a fairly regular basis the creative workshops, or workshops on creativity.
I would like to do it more regularly. It's been sporadic thus far.
And do you have, people have to have, for it to stick, they have to have a simplified formula of some kind. Do you have a formula that you put forward for a person to draw on their creativity?
I encourage people during a kind of a guided meditation to remember instances from childhood when they can find and they can know that there was an object that was something other than its literal representation. Find those moments of transformative imagination, transformative play. And at times when I'm working with people and we're doing the relaxation session, I give them a narrative that they can re-experience so they can access the memory that they just created again. So a lot of what I do has to do with the role of memory and the structure of brain.
Now, you're working fairly closely with the Circle located on Whitten Road. I want to give that address where people can go look at your jewelry and maybe come to one of your creativity classes.
Off the top of my head, I don't know the address. I know it's just north of the Harley place, right next to Quiznos Subs. And Pew's Flowers.
Yeah. And the fast signs. Fast signs on one side, Quiznos on the other
That's
side.
right. That's right.
Yeah, this is just down the hill.
You know,
when you come down from Summer, it's just down the hill on the Whitten Road.
And
on the right.
as I hear people saying it's near this, it's near that, it's a little particular area of Whitten that pretty much encompasses all of human experience. There's a, there's a veterinary, a chiropractor, a funeral home, a church, a restaurant. We got it all.
Well, do you have any classes scheduled? They can go there now and see the jewelry, but do you have classes or anything booked?
On the 22nd of July, or the 22nd of June, I will be at the Circle from noon to 7 doing aura portraits.
Okay.
You use somewhat, in fact, I might say a lot of hypnosis, self-hypnosis, and
Yes.
it didn't say so.
No, I have not been trained or certified as a
You don't want to
hypnotist.
say, but that kind of work obviously has to do with helping a person come into a stage where they can, well, transcend is a good word.
It's an excellent word, and sure, how we can describe it subjectively is that I use a structured narrative to induce a deep-seated state of imaginative relaxation.
He just can't say it, that's all. He can't say it.
No, don't say it. I can say it.
Now, next year's income tax refund, that's what I'm going to spend some money on.
Might be a good idea.
Well, we had recently Richard Irvin here.
Yes.
Who talked a lot about hypnosis because he is the Irvin Hypnosis Center. Did you have a question for
No, I was
John?
just laughing because you got his name right.
Yes, they're joking about the fact that I keep calling him Irwin instead of Irvin. And that's because I have a very close friend named Irwin, and I talk to him more frequently. Did you have a question for John? Okay. Is there any illustrations or anything that you can give us? We've got a little bit of time about what you would like to see happen or what you would like to do.
Well, what I would suggest, if somebody would like to experience or find the whole thing of archetypal images and the collective superconsciousness was elucidated as in academic terms first by Carl Jung, and of course it has a lot to do with the long history of lore and myth and mind-to-mind contact. But over the course of his lifetime, he collected his own art and his own thoughts and narrative into something that emerged and was called the Red Book. And it was not published at the time of his death. His family was very concerned that whatever be done with it be true to the original work. And it has recently been published, and there are copies of it in circulation at the library. So if you want to look at the work of a medical mind, a medically trained mind, an artist, and somebody who is really a pioneer in the idea of archetypal images and the subconsciousness. I would suggest getting a copy of the Red Book and just browsing for a couple hours. It's marvelous.
Now, his interest there had a great deal to do with dreams. Dream interpretation work was what I think spurred that archetypical study on, wasn't it?
Yes.
And was there anything you might could reveal to our listeners about that process and his work? Do you do anything like that yourself in dream interpretation work?
No, and I've always been, because I'm convinced there are two types of dreams. One is just what happens when the brain is idling, and the other is imaginary activity where we somehow seek resolution to dramas or events that are going on in our lives. I had a dream myself that I've only told 4 or 5 people about. I was very, very young. It's the first memory I have, and it was quite emotionally traumatic, and it stayed vivid with me over the years. And I recently described it to someone who does work with Shamanic Journey down in Jackson, and she gave me an interpretation of that I find is resonant with a theme that's played out over the events of my life for about the last 20 or 30 years.
So on the one hand, you've got almost the hypnosis thing where you're doing visualization before going to bed, and then in the dreams, then you're getting answers back, or you're getting a plan, or something's working in there. It's pretty amazing stuff.
Well, the brain can't do anything at random. The brain can't do anything at random. So, although it seems to us to be, I've often thought I seem to have a random image generator in my mind, but the brain only can work with information that's already been stored. So whatever in our dreams, we're extracting something and revisioning it.
And put it to work maybe on a different level, on the subconscious level, or whatever.
I think yes, and a lot of it depends on what we choose to do with it.
Go ahead and give our viewers your contact numbers again one more time.
Okay, my cell phone is area code 901-230-6198, and I hope I get a barrage of calls from y'all, okay? And my email is John Madsen, the last word is spelled, and the last name is spelled M-A-D-S-E-N, John Madsen 53 at yahoo.org, or friend me on Facebook. I love Facebook. .com, I'm sorry, you're right. John Madsen 53 at yahoo.com. Make a note too, you might want to, of the name Dylan Blue. Yeah. Dylan, like Bob Dylan's last name, Blue, like the color. That's my grandson's name, and it's a brand name I've used for my jewelry, and I'm this close to having a functional e-commerce website up with blog and yada yada yada. So that will be dylanblue.com.
If you, depending upon how you are viewing or where you're viewing the core concepts from, I want to remind you that all of the core concepts lecture series can be found by going to youtube.com and then typing in Renford, R-E-N-F-O-R-D, Broadcast Network. And then you'll see a number of pictures come up. Some of them will be of some of these lectures. If you'll look for the Whiskered Wizard, that's me. Click on that, and then that'll take you to the home page. And you can view now somewhere in the neighborhood of 35, 36 of these lectures. And I think they're unusual. And I know that you can find on the internet virtually anything that you know to look for. But with this series, you may find some things you wouldn't have even known to look for. So we want to invite you to do that, and also to note at that site, the Radio by Renford site, blogtalkradio.com/Renford. We have 10 shows a week, and hosts from New York and Boston to Denver, and one out of the Netherlands. So keep those things in mind. if you would like. Now, for those in the studio audience, there's a free CD on the laws of material wealth. There's also the scroll with the Renford affirmations. This is a mindset change. It's like rebooting your computer, okay? If you have a problem with the computer, the first thing they're going to tell you is reboot it. So this is a rebooting process. Again, this show is sponsored by Open Heart Spiritual Center, the Institute of Applied Metaphysics, and the Church of Revelation. I want to thank you for being with us on core concepts today, and thank you, John, for being with us, and our panelists with their questions. Have a good evening.